Hello, my name is Dr. Karen Kossie-Chernyshev, and I'd like to welcome you to SWATH 2021, Absolute Equality, Pursuing the Promise. Today is the last day of SWATH 2021. Of course, we have not exhausted all topics related to what we're going to speak about today, or that we've spoken about over the past 3 days, but we have definitely made a very important first step. So, our leaders, the leaders for this year's conference include myself, Dr. Karen Kossie-Chernyshev. I'm the founding director of SWATH, Nelva Williamson, and Tomiko Meeks, a professor at Texas Southern University. We would like to start with a greeting from our acting provost and senior vice president for academic affairs, who's also a professor of education, administration, and foundations.
I am Dr. Lillian Post, Acting Provost and Senior Vice President at Texas Southern University. We are delighted that you've agreed to join us and participate in SWATH 2021, focusing on absolute equality, pursuing the promise. It is a summer workshop on African American Texas history. We are expecting that you will learn a lot, hear good information from people in the field of law, education, and history, and be able to have a better understanding of some of the critical issues in our society. As you go through the sessions, I'm hoping that it will be great for you to be able to dialogue with others in light of these experiences. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Kossie-Chernyshev and her committee for the work that they've done in bringing this excellent programming to Texas Southern University, albeit virtually. I wish you a great time, good understanding, and most of all, great dialogue as you discuss some of the critical issues of society today. Enjoy. Have a great time.
Thank you, Dr. Post. On day one, we heard from Dr. Brian Franklin, Associate Director for the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University, and Dr. Collette Bloom, Professor of Education in the College of Education at Texas Southern University. They discussed House Bill 2497. They also discussed House Bill 3979, and we also commented on the establishment of Juneteenth as a national holiday. The program for that day was moderated by Dr. Ramona. Yesterday, we had presentations from Dr. Merline Pitre, Professor of History at Texas Southern, and Professor Tomiko Meeks. They focused on Senate Bill 1 and House Bill 3, and that program was moderated by Nelva Williamson, history educator for advanced placement in HISD, and also serving as co-director of SWATH this year. Today, we have a special guest, Dr. Darlene Breaux from TAPSI. She's also Vice President of A-Leaf School Board and Chair of the Policy Committee. We also have Dr. James Douglas, Distinguished Professor of Law at Thurgood Marshall School of Law, and Dr. Jesse Esparza. So I'm going to first introduce Dr. Darlene Breaux. According to leadership profiles, Dr. Breaux excels as a strategic maximizer and connector who possesses empathy and intellection. As a maximizer, she focuses on ways to stimulate personal and group excellence. Dr. Breaux noted in her profile, "I have faith in links between things. I believe that everything is connected and there are few coincidences or chance encounters." She was School Board Member of the Year in the A-Leaf Independent School District. She is a member of the Houston Area Alliance of Black School Educators. She also is a member of the Texas Alliance of Black School Educators, and she's a member of the Texas Education Policy Institute of that group. Her educational background includes a doctoral degree in educational organization from Abilene Christian University, a graduate certificate in conflict management and leadership at Abilene Christian University, a Master of Science in Education educational leadership. She graduated with honors from that institution. And she also, we are honored that she has a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Texas Southern University. And she is also a former Miss TSU. Dr. Breaux.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I do not have a PowerPoint today because I believe the power should be in the points that we will be discussing today. So I was asked to present a position statement on behalf of the Texas Alliance of Black School Educators and the Texas Education Policy Institute, TPI. The Texas Alliance of Black School Educators will bolster a force for transformation through equity, efficacy, and policy to ensure unobstructed opportunities for students of African descent and the educators that serve them. The Texas Education Policy Institute, or TPI as we affectionately call it, focuses on the development of educational policy that benefits all students, but specifically those who impact students of African descent. Our current position statement is that the creation of the bills that we will be discussing today, House Bill 3979, House Bill 2497, and Senate Bill 3, is the attempt by certain legislators to force into law what should actually live in the Texas education standards. TAPSI and TPI wholeheartedly support the teaching of multiple perspectives of the Texas history and believe that Texas teachers will continue to abide by their professional commitment to teach the Texas standards without deference to one's personal opinion. TAPSI and TPI believe that the politicization of the Texas essential knowledge and skills create a misguided narrative of what is being taught in our Texas classrooms, and ultimately requires districts to defend, define, and make sense of unfunded beliefs for parents. TAPSI and TPI will continue to advocate for and support academic exploration and discourse, which allows the Texas teachers and students to value the historical contributions of Texas residents. Furthermore, TAPSI and TPI encourage exploration and academic discourse by Texas students who seek to understand current realities in the nation, the state, and in our communities. TAPSI and TPI in no way seek the intentional degradation of any race or gender, as the organization's focus has been and will continue to be on enlightenment through education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Breaux, for that statement. Very strong statement. I would love for you to also send a copy of the statement to me so that we can make it part of the archive, of SWATH's archive. Thank you. Okay, next I would like to introduce Dr. James Douglas. Some of you've heard the phrase Morehouse man. Well, if anybody, if TSU ever had a TSU man, I would think that that person would be Dr. James Douglas. Dr. James Douglas serves as Distinguished Professor of Law at Thurgood Marshall School of Law at Texas Southern University. He has worn many hats at Texas Southern University, including having served as Dean of Thurgood Marshall School of Law and President of Texas Southern University. Committed to the community at large, he has also served as President of the local NAACP. His educational background is varied. It includes a BA in mathematics from Texas Southern University, a JD from Texas Southern University, a JSM in computer law from Stanford University, and also he began working on a master's degree in sociology from Texas Southern University. I'm honored to have worked with Dr. James Douglas when the Urban Academic Village was established at Texas Southern, and it was there that I learned just how, what an intelligent mediator he is, someone who really cares about the institution and someone who also cares about TSU. So I yield the floor to Dr. James Douglas.
Right. It says you have my video off.
Okay, I will turn it on. Sorry about that. So if you can start your video, Doctor, I did try to start it now, please. There you go. I think you're muted, Dr. Douglas.
Okay.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear and see you.
One of the things I always, okay. One of the things I tell my students is that when you're confronted with a problem, one of the things you want to know, which is most important, is not just what the problem is, but why and how did it all get started. And so I know Dr. Pitre talked somewhat on yesterday about post-Reconstruction in Texas and the fact that we had all these African-American legislators elected during that time. But I want to talk first a little about Texas history and what led us to where we are now. And this is one of the things that they don't want taught in class. They really don't want American history taught, and they definitely don't want Texas history taught. Because you go back to the, I don't want to say the foundation of Texas, but the inhabitant of Texas by the white settlers, and that is the white Europeans. Remember when Mexico was offering this free land, the people who came to Texas were people from Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and they came from slave states. And so when they came to Mexico, and Mexico was not interested in slavery, one of the things that they don't teach, even in Texas history, that one of the reasons for the Texas Revolution had to do with the fact that Mexico would not approve these new settlers from the United States bringing slaves in. So after we won our independence and became a free state, we still had slaves. Most people don't know that when Abraham Lincoln was elected, between his November election and his April inauguration, 7 states seceded from the Union. This was even before Lincoln was even seated in the presidency. One of those states was Texas. So now we have Texas involved in 2 revolutions. These are the same people who today don't want Texas history taught, because they don't want people to know that Texas was as racist as it turned out to be. Two, conservative white people listen just like we listen. They know that according to the census, in a couple of decades, Texas is going to be a majority state of color. They don't want equality in election. They don't want the majority to control the state. So if you don't want a majority to control the state, you have to put in apartheid type legislation.
Dr. Douglas, we've lost a connection with Dr. Douglas. I really appreciate the historical background that he's providing for us. It shows just, the overlap between history and law, and well, the laws are basically telling how people are actually going to, how things are going to work in a given society anyway. Just hold 1 second, please. Hello, Dr. Douglas. So I think what we'll do, in the interest of time, Professor Esparza, we'll go ahead and let you present. And we'll try to get Dr. Douglas on again, okay? So let me introduce Dr. Jessie Esparza. Okay, Dr. Jessie Esparza is, hold 1 second. Yes, Doc. Okay, great. Hold 1 second. Thank you for your patience. I am readmitting Dr. Douglas, and he will continue. All right. Dr. Douglas, please unmute yourself and turn your video on.
All right, can you hear me?
I can hear you on the phone, but we can't hear you on, can you hear, we can't hear you through the computer. Okay, let me turn, I'm gonna hang up the phone and maybe it'll come through. Good, that did it. Go ahead, we can hear you.
Now.
It's a little choppy.
Well,
We can hear you, but it's a little choppy. So what we
I
can,
don't know what it is.
we can hear you now, go. It's clear.
Where did I fall off?
You were talking about the fact that white settlers in Texas, and particularly even those where we are now, they're concerned that we have, in 10 years, we'll have a minority state, and that there is resistance to that. Mhm.
So they learned from South Africa that the way you control if you are not in the majority is through the electoral process. So this is why when the Supreme Court decided that gerrymandering was permissible, that gave the minority, the whites, a vehicle for maintaining control of the system, notwithstanding the fact that they don't have the election. So when people say why do they want to restrict the vote? They want to restrict the vote because if they restrict the vote, that's a way for them to maintain control. They can also maintain control by the gerrymandering. All right, so that's one of the reasons, let's say in a state like Texas, where even though the majority of the people live in major cities, all right, Texas is controlled by the rural areas through gerrymandering. All right, so they have put in place a mechanism to maintain control. Now, Doc, you know, when you took American history in high school, and probably when you took it in college, it was watered down. Nobody told you that when this country was founded, that it was really intended to be for the benefit of rich white men.
Right.
Minorities didn't vote when this country was founded. Women didn't vote when this country was founded. People who didn't own property couldn't vote when this country was founded. So when people talk about, let's go back to the original intent, the original intent was to make sure that white men stayed in control of everything. And so that's all that's happening in Austin today, is they're trying to put a system in place that guarantees that white men remain in place. And one way to do that is to keep people ignorant about how we got to where we are. They don't want people to know how we got to where we are, because if we figured out how we got to where we are, we might figure out a way to change it. And so the last thing, Austin, the people in control, the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the state legislature, the last thing they want is for a generation of Texans to grow up really understanding Texas history and what Texas history is all about and how we got to where we are.
Thank you for providing that detailed historical overview that Texas.
You know, I've always been a radical from the inside.
Okay.
External, but I'm an internal radical.
Right. Well, I think
the only way we can turn the tide is to be able to take back control of the Texas legislature. And it's going to take a huge effort to turn the tides, but that means every single person who does not like what is happening in Austin today is going to have to get out and vote. That's the only way you can turn the tide in this democratic representative society that we live in. And all these people who say their vote doesn't count, it really doesn't count if you don't vote. So that's the best way to make sure your vote doesn't count. So we're going to have to do a tremendous effort in the upcoming election and the future upcoming elections to turn the tide, because right now they have control. And as long as the longer they have control, the more laws they are going to put in place to make sure that they maintain control.
Okay, so help us understand then why, how a change. So Dr. Burgess, help us understand how a change at the national level, in voting legislation at the national level, how can that help us down here in Texas? Like, our legislators have gone up to DC and they're getting thrown in jail. They want national attention to be brought to this voting issue. So how will approving new legislation at the national level, how will that help us in Texas?
Well, it will help us in federal elections. That
Mm,
is, when we elect people of Congress, when we elect people to the Senate, when we elect the president and vice president, that would be very, very helpful to us because, believe it or not, even though we might not control state politics, if we can control national politics, that would be extremely helpful also.
mhm.
Because of the separation of power between the state and the federal government, there's nothing they can do on a national level to tell us how to vote in Texas.
Okay.
And this is why this is really important. If we elect the right people to the Senate, see, people don't understand the two most important elections in this country is the presidential election and the Senate election, because those two entities control who sits on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, you know, when you took civics in high school, they told you there were three branches of government, but they didn't tell you that one was much more powerful than the other two, and that is the Supreme Court of the United States. Because there's a joke that two Supreme Court justices were talking to each other, and one said to the other, "We may not always be right, but we are always final." So the Supreme Court determines what the law is in the United States. It
Mhm.
is the Supreme Court that decided in Dred Scott, all right, that a slave who left a slave state and went to a free state still remained a slave. It was the Supreme Court that decided in Plessy that segregation was legal. It was the Supreme Court that decided in Brown that segregation was illegal. So it is the Supreme Court that decides. It is the Supreme Court that decided gerrymandering was legal. Believe me, if we could have done away with gerrymandering, the majority would still be in control. But gerrymandering was the vehicle in which they were able to take away control. So why do I say the president and the Senate is so important? Is because the president nominates and the Senate approves people who sit on the most powerful institution in this country. And we as voters control who the president is and who the members of the Senate are.
Wow, that's so important. Thank you for that detailed explanation. Do any of the panelists have questions for Dr. Douglas? One of the questions I see is, here's a question in the chat box from Dr. Pruitt. Dr. Douglas, she says, what is the breakdown of Democrats and Republicans in the state legislature now? Is it Republicans 60% and Democrats 40%? What is the best way of organizing people around this issue?
If I remember correctly, the numerical breakdown is 100 Republicans in the House and 54 Democrats.
Mm.
In the Senate, I think it's 13 to 21 or something like that. But they have complete control. And that's one of the reasons the Democrats left the House, is because there's no way they can control the vote. If they can't get some Republicans to go along with them in the present state of politics in Texas, Republicans are never going to go along with Democrats anyway. So the only way they could control it was to break the quorum. Now the question becomes, how many times are they willing to leave the state in order to break the quorum? But it's the Republicans know they are in complete control and they can do whatever they want to do. And I understand why the Democrats left the state, because remember during the regular session, they tried to negotiate. and the Republicans made it clear that they had no intentions of negotiating any of these issues. And so the only thing they could do was lead a state. And I guess I've heard some of them analogize by saying this is their form of the filibuster, which the Republicans pulled in the US Senate. So this is their form of filibustering.
Okay, I have one other question, and this is at the national level related to Joe Manchin and the other senator whose name I can't remember. How is it that, it's almost like so much power is in the hands of these two people with regards to voting right, to voting? And it just, I'm trying to understand how they don't seem to have the same kind of loyalty that we see among the Republicans in Texas and some of the other states.
Two things you have to understand. We have gotten to a place politically in the United States where statesmanship doesn't mean anything.
Mm.
It used to be that people in the same party could disagree with each other, and that was understandable. But now, especially on the Republican side, if you disagree with the leadership, then you're ostracized. So everyone has to go along with whatever the Republican plan is. And so you see people, you see what happened to people who break rank. They get attacked by their own party.
Okay. I don't know. It seems like there's such a sense of urgency with regards to voting rights, and I just can't imagine how these two senators don't seem to understand, or maybe they do, because I hate to say this, but could it just be that, for a person who is white and a Democrat or a Republican, they win either way? So I'm wondering to what degree that's some of it.
No, I don't. Look, America for a long time is still going to be a white country, even when minorities are in the majority. So in our lifetime, we will never see a situation where people of color are going to be in control of this country. But one of the things that conservative whites understand is that you don't begin to protect your control once you've lost it. And so they can see on the horizon that if they don't do something, they are going to lose control. And this is one of the reasons they're fighting so hard now.
So in other words, you have to work hard to be supreme.
Right.
You have to work hard to, right. White supremacy is hard work. Okay.
Remember, they came up with slavery, with the, and I know people say, well, they had slaves for centuries before America was founded, but not the kind of slavery that we had in America. There's nowhere else in the history of the world where we had the kind of slavery that we had in America.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dr. Douglas. It's an excellent discussion. We're gonna now move to Professor Esparza, Jesse Esparza, whom I'd like to formally introduce. Give me 1 second. So Professor Jesse Esparza is a beloved professor at Texas Southern University. He has presented at regional and national conferences. He has authored numerous articles, encyclopedia entries, book chapters, and his forthcoming book, Race Schools, Latino, Asian, and Black Educational Autonomy and Activism in Texas from 1920 to 1980, is currently in currently in review with the University of Oklahoma Press. It is a comparative study of Latino, Asian, and African-American owned schools in Texas since the end of World War I through the post-civil rights era, when the federal government in 1971 concerned mainly with the issue of school segregation, forced school districts throughout the state to consolidate. So I'm pleased to introduce to you Dr. Jesse Esparza.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you everybody for the invitation to invite me and put this wonderful 3-day session and panel and conference together. It's super important that we have these kinds of conversations. I am going to share a PowerPoint that I put together to help facilitate this talk. And so I am going to sort of share that with you. I don't know how you see it on your screen. It's something funny happened on my side here. And so you probably can see other slides, or maybe you see just one slide at a time. But I'll deliver like this nevertheless, as I address sort of the issue of the newest House Bill 3979. And so I titled the talk, I titled the portion of today's session, at least my specific talk, I titled it Teaching for the Liberation of All Peoples. And that really is the framework that I use and sort of the methodology that I use and the pedagogy that I use when I walk into a classroom, or since COVID, when I walk into these virtual spaces to interact with students. But I'll tell you that, as you already know, earlier this month, or in June, excuse me, June 15th of this year, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, signed into law House Bill 3979. And we had a discussion of this bill on day one, and I won't sort of reintroduce those kinds of things, but I do want to echo the sentiments of the presenters from that day. And I agree with them. I concur 100% that I think that this bill is a dangerous bill. It attempts to control, and it does control in many ways, teacher and student speech interaction in schools. As you all know, it prohibits it prohibits important conversations about race and racism, discrimination, current events. And as you all know, the Texas legislature is going to ram this bill, sort of with little input from students and teachers and people of color and educators and so forth, parents. And it seemingly, as we are learning more about it, we know that the Abbott administration seems to be bowing down to a small group of donors and political operatives who are leading their efforts to sort of whitewash history as we understand it, place a gag order on academic freedom and on freedom of speech is what I'm arguing here. Now, one of these political operatives, and really one that I think is leading the charge, is a group known as the 1776 Project PAC. This is a political entity committed to impacting public education nationwide by targeting schools that teach critical race theory, or anything that this PAC calls and identifies as critical race theory. And so, for example, they go after the 1619 Project. This is a wonderful project. This curriculum, we use it on our campus. Professor Meeks, who presented yesterday, she and I throughout the summer worked with faculty on our campus to implement this curriculum for incoming freshmen. And we love it and we support it. And this 1776 Project PAC disagrees with us, and so they're trying to put a gag order on that. And so back to this project, to this Project PAC, what they do what they're doing also is this PAC is working to elect school board members committed to reforming, as they say, public education into what they identify as patriotic and proudful American history. Like on their website, for example, you can literally go to their website, and I provided it here for you on this slide. On their website, the 1776projectpac.com, they have a pop-up that asks people to report a school promoting critical race theory, and it's a simple form. The person just goes to the website, they type in the name of the school, and they provide a contact email, and seemingly, the men in black hats come out and put an end to it, sort of the Gestapo tactic kinds of methods that they're using. And so I would agree with Dr. Monica Martinez, who is one of the co-founders of an organization called Refusing to Forget, or manages the Refusing to Forget project, This is a collective of historians and scholars committed to documenting the history of racial violence along the Mexico-Texas border. I agree with her when she states that it's alarming how easy it is for a parent or anyone to make an accusation and submit such a claim to this pact. And so many teachers have expressed their commitment to teaching the truth, to truth telling. But at the same time, as I'm hearing, they are also expressing fears of repercussions from websites like this. And I'll say also that the attack on critical race theory and critical race studies, the messaging has been false, flagrantly false, and incredibly damaging to, I think, the general public's understanding of what this is. Not many people know that this is a framework and nothing more. And so certainly it is impacting and bringing to light sort of whether or not there is a need to teach accurate histories of race in the United States. And so certainly critical race theory for all of us sort of viewing, it's a framework, as I indicated. It's sort of used to explain why there exists inequality, in this case, race inequality or racial inequality in our society. I once heard a teacher describe it this way when she was using sort of unhoused populations as an example. She was sort of, when you think about the unhoused populations, let's say in major urban centers like Houston, they are oftentimes predominantly people of color, Chicanos, African Americans, and so forth. And then this teacher says, now looking at that, without critical race theory, any human might begin to create a narrative that says, well, they are homeless and they are unhoused because they're lazy and they don't work hard. That might be one narrative that we construct. Another narrative that this educator went on to say is that we might construct by looking at these persons who are overwhelmingly people of color. We might say, well, they're drug users and drug abusers, and that is what sort of resulted in them becoming homeless and unhoused. And so this is the narratives that any human being can create. She went on to say, but if we use critical race theory as a framework, we might begin to ask if there are other things that explain why these populations, who are overwhelmingly people of color, unhoused. And so, for example, we could ask ourselves, is there legislation that disproportionately affects brown and black home buyers, for example, or renters, or people who try to lease, that can affect, right, that sort of explains why the great number of our unhoused population in Houston is African American or Mexican American? Or if there are no laws, perhaps there are, if we use this critical race sort of theory as a framework, perhaps there are structural inequalities, like in our financing, like in access to higher education, that negatively impact Chicanos and Blacks. That also might be questions that can help us try to explain and understand the high number of Black and brown unhoused populations in the United States. And that's what this framework is. It's essentially a tool to get us to ask different questions and to come up with different kinds of alternative narratives. And alternative narratives are, those are essential and those are important. And not many people know that. Not many people know that. And so they push bills like this to try to, as they say, as many people would say, to whitewash this history. And here's a figure here of unhoused populations according to ethno-racial breakdown. Now, I'll also tell you that this bill, House Bill 3979, also endangers ethnic studies as we understand it today, like it exists on our campuses. And I'm thinking, the several studies that fall within the umbrella ethnic studies, like Mexican American studies, like African American studies, like Native American, Asian American, Puerto Rican studies, certainly women and gender studies, certainly K through 12, and potentially also at the institutions of higher learning. And so this is why this bill is very damaging and very dangerous because of what it could potentially do. Now, I'm not surprised to see this bill sort of push through, and I'm not surprised to see it ram through with such speed as it was, because I understand that we sort of live in a nation, and we sort of live in a nation where where there is a history of trying to whitewash history. I get that. Because there has long been a sustained attack on these kinds of frameworks. We only have to go back 10 years to see an example of this. In fact, let me take you there. In 2010, 2012, or a little bit over 10 years, I imagine, but in Arizona, the state of Arizona, what they're going to do is they are going to pass their own House Bill 2281. The Mexican American Studies program there in Arizona is going to face similar attacks like the way our critical race studies courses and classes and certainly Chicano and Black studies classes are facing today within our own state. And this was done by a conservative element who believed that MAS, in the case of Arizona, Mexican American Studies, and all the programs that sort of fall within it, that it was dangerous, that it was un-American, that it taught courses that they believe spread hate and resentment, and courses that encourage the overthrow of the government. And so they moved to ban it, to ban these courses. And ground zero, as I mentioned, is Arizona. In 2010, placed a ban on ethnic studies. They only went after Mexican American in this case. And then the then governor of Arizona, Jan Brewer, is going to sign House Bill 2281. So Abbott is doing what other governors had done in other states, where it's sort of a copycat kind of movement in many ways. But Brewer signs this bill, and it prohibits school districts and even charter schools there from including in their curriculums the following things. This is according to their bill that they passed. They prohibit the teaching of courses that include the following elements. Number one, courses that promote the overthrow of the US government. This is what they said Mexican American Studies is doing. Number two, courses that promoted resentment towards any race or any class. Courses that advocated ethnic solidarity, but that's a no-no. And courses that were designed for a certain minority group or ethno-racial group, in this case, Mexican Americans, although these classes were offered to anybody. And so those found to violate this bill, the 2281 bill in Arizona in 2010, they were liable and then going to lose funding as a public institution. And similar things are happening here in this state. Those who are liable for violating HB 3979 are to face similar kinds of consequences. And so as a result, the largest school district, let me go to the next slide, the largest school district in Arizona during this period is the Tucson Unified School District. And so the program there taught by the school district came under scrutiny and was found to be in violation of that bill and was disbanded. Now, this, even though the state of Arizona launched its own audit paid for by the state, that is the taxpayers, and that audit found that this program was not in breach of House Bill 2281. The state superintendent and the district superintendent, along with the governor, they all colluded together and they had the program shut down nevertheless. And MAS has gone from Arizona. And so we've seen these kinds of attacks before. They're not new, and I'm not surprised and shocked to see it happening here in Texas. If we go back to, if we even go further than that, really since its founding, when you think about the origins of these kinds of courses and these kinds of curriculums, Chicano studies, Black studies, and so forth, those date all the way back to the 1960s. Some argue it even predates the 60s period. But they emerged for the most part out of the civil rights activism of that period. Like, for example, the Chicano movement. It's going to be the Chicano movement that births Mexican American studies, Chicano studies, and so forth, Puerto Rican studies, and even. And so, when you sort of think about these courses being founded since that period, even in that period, they encountered several kinds of problems. Like, for starters, there were never enough faculty in college, or the number of faculty in those colleges and on those campuses were so small that departments and colleges often said, well, we need you to teach something else and you can't teach that. Or they would say, as I indicated earlier in Arizona, they would immediately accuse faculty and those classes of producing radicals and revolutionaries, and sort of trying to indoctrinate students and those kinds of things. Or they might say departments often told faculty that there was never a strong enough interest on the part of students to create a demand for those classes. Or the other things that many departments did, this is back in the 60s, moving through the 70s, is many departments refused to give credit to students who took these kinds of classes in hopes of dissuading them from doing so. And so all this to tell you is that there has long been a history of sustained attack on this kind of framework. And so coming full circle, if I go to my next slide, coming full circle, we sort of look at HB 3979. I mean, here we go again. This bill threatens ethnic studies. It threatens these kinds of frameworks and critical race studies that would emerge out of similar, out of this sort of these frameworks. And not many people know this in Texas. And so I'll just take just a few moments to share. A couple of years ago, it looked like the state was on the path towards really trying to democratize the state, education in many ways. The State Board of Education, for example, they a couple of years ago overwhelmingly voted to add courses to include special topics in the social studies curriculum. Classes like Mexican, African, Native American, Asian studies, and those kinds of things. Here, closer to home in Houston is where we are. In Houston, the school board for HISD, the largest school district in Texas and among the largest in the nation, they voted to approve Mexican American studies as an elective counting towards graduation, given, right, that, according to TEA, that over 50% of students in HISD and statewide were not Latino. And so in doing so, this is what we did back in just a few years ago. In doing so, the state legislature was showing good faith that, one, we could initiate curriculum that is more reflective of the student body. And given current trends, our campuses are going to be filled with more people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That's going to be, for the most part, our student body. It also shows that these programs improve student retention in K-12. The Latino dropout rate, for example, decreased significantly since the implementation of these courses. And then at the same time, graduation rates began to increase by all the way to 83%. And so these kinds of courses where we think critically and talk about race and class and so forth, they improve graduation rates in K-12. And then they also improve college entrance rates among our graduates from high school. And then the same thing happens there. It improves retention in colleges and universities. And then it also improves graduation rates from colleges and universities. But the problem is that many people don't care to listen to that or don't want to listen to that. And so they pass bills like HB 3979. It's poised to undo all of that, unfortunately. I read online that many people were saying, well, this is just a tactic and a ploy on the part of the governor to sort of distract people from his leadership failures, right? They make reference to the power grid failures, or they make reference to the mismanagement of vaccine applications, COVID and things like that. And that might be true. I mean, it's a series of failures on the part of this administration. That might be true, but I think that there are other more pending consequences from this bill and other bills like it, SB3 and things like that, because they have the potential to do all the progress that has been made in America's public school system regarding transformative education, regarding equitable education, regarding educational equality. And so when we consider the history, for example, of educational inequality in our schools, we know that people of color, students of color, Chicano, African-American, and so forth, that they experience high dropout rates, that they were tracked into vocational classes or into industrial classrooms that were designed to privilege the rich and underserve the poor. They were subjected to a curriculum that was devoid of their history and their culture. They were often confronted with hostile teachers and administrators. Certainly they were segregated. They were arbitrarily suspended or expelled. They were viewed as culturally inferior, unhygienic, apathetic towards education. Their buildings suffered. Their buildings were smaller. They were outdated. Schools and classrooms suffered inadequate space. Some of their schools didn't have libraries. Some of them didn't have laboratories, restrooms. Students also lacked proper school supplies. And so they suffered consequently, this insufficient funds, consequently, the financing that is, it's inherently racist. And so consequently, Chicanos and African-American students had high literacy rates. Poorer funding also meant that brown and Black faculty and administrators, they received substandard wages. And so all this to tell you is that it's policies like HB 39 that allow these kinds of atrocities historically to exist in our public school systems. And if we allow these bills to remain, or if we embrace these bills, then we should be preparing ourselves for the return of some of these things that have bedeviled Chicano and African-American communities since before the turn of the 20th century, because it all sort of results in the same, an inferior educational experience. And so all that to tell you is that, but there are next steps. I know that there's a lot of teachers who are going to be watching this and listening to this and are listening now. I don't want to sort of paint just the gloom picture, I do want to make the point that there are, there's things in motion. There are nearly 200 historians who have signed a petition joining several historical associations where they have asked and publicly opposed this bill. There is either already litigation currently underway or about to be underway by several organizations and school districts that are looking to repeal this bill. And I think that those things are a great starting point. I think that it falls on all of us to think creatively on how to provide a transformative education, as I mentioned, to our students regarding race and ethnicity and gender and sexuality, and even class, and using frameworks like critical race theory are often the best way to do so. I think that if we use frameworks like that, then we can all really become teachers and teach for the liberation of all peoples. And it really helps our students maximize their time in the classroom. I think that it helps them become free thinkers and really liberated learners. And in the interest of time, I'll end it there because I know we might have some Q&A afterwards. So I'll end it there. Thank you. Dr. Kossie, I think you're mute.
Thank you. That was outstanding. I appreciate the charge. I feel energized. I wanted to ask you, is the petition still active?
The petition that I showed was a bill that was signed and sent to the governor's office before June 15th.
Okay.
So that one is not active. There are others that are asking the governor to repeal the bill.
Okay.
And I can share those with you so you can share with those in viewing.
Well, thank you for outlining the various ways in which the bill is deleterious, right? The problems that are there, and for contextualizing everything historically. I'd like to know if there are any questions from those of us who are on the panel, Dr. Pruitt or Nelva.
I do see that there is a question from Dr. Pruitt in the chat, and this is to Dr. Breaux, Dr. Douglas, and Professor Esparza. How do educators and scholars best fight this idea of teaching critical race theory in K-12 schools? And Dr. Pruitt also asked, how does a state that prides itself in its history want to erase the history of people of color, women, and religious minorities? Have any of you heard how they are trying to justify that issue of the erasure of women, people of color, and people of who might be practicing within a religious minority?
Yeah. Well, I'll say briefly that I will echo the statement and the sentiment of Dr. Franklin. I believe it was Dr. Franklin who on day one encouraged teachers to teach history through the use of primary records and primary sources, because those are treasured records. And I think that if the teachers emphasized the use and relied heavily on the use of these records, that'll be a great way to say, well, look, we're using the records by the state to teach. And I think that'll be a great way to push back against this bill and really find ways. That's the creative way, to find creative ways, novel ways to educate our students on these critical kinds of topics and issues. And so the use of primary sources, that could be primary records in the archives, but really that can also be oral histories, testimonies, the storytelling from community members, from our elders, interviews done of our activists from the present all the way to when they started collecting interviews. We can even look at the slave narratives, the WPA project and things like that. So really, I would echo what Dr. Franklin mentioned. I always put an emphasis in my classroom to look at and explore primary sources, both collections in an archive, collections and people's personal attics and stuff like that, but also oral histories, interviews, online repositories. And I have links and stuff that I can share with Dr. Kossie so that she can make it part of the collection here so that teachers can access it as well. Online repositories where there are 20 interviews or there are 120 interviews that are done on brown and black activists in Texas and beyond.
Yeah, even encouraging the students to do family history as well. Go ahead, Dr. Breaux.
Yes, I am so glad, Jesse, that you mentioned that, because I was just typing that in the chat because I saw that email, and I agree, because really, if you look at some of the, well, specifically House Bill 3979, it's very convoluted. It's where if you look at what's already being taught, it's already it's impossible to really do this, because it already lives in the standards. If the teachers continue to teach the standards and use those primary resources that are available to them, then it should not be an issue. As long it really encouraged through Texas history and social studies history, it already encourages the looking at those things through multiple lenses, neither good nor bad, but just multiple lenses. And then and teachers are always encouraged not to infuse their own personal opinion. So why are we putting this into law, which already lives in the standards? That's what kind of makes it, just confuses everything.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to host the workshop, though, was for us to, those of us who are scholars, who are professional educators, so we have the opportunity to think through, look at the documents from our various perspectives, and help other educators who, for whatever reason, may not have had the time to look at the pieces of legislation. And so it is a kind of frustrating encounter to read all that's there. And so the goal of SWATH this year was to help go through those documents, to kind of demystify and to point out, just as you have, just how ridiculous so much of it is. Yes.
Do you already believe the legislature cares
About, I'm sure they care about the constituents.
about whether everyone understands what they mean? They want you to be confused. They don't want you to teach anything.
Right.
And that's the whole intent.
And so what I'm glad Dr. Jesse Esparza, go ahead. Dr. Douglas, go ahead.
I said, confusion is the intent.
That's the intent. Mm-hmm.
They don't want anybody to understand the statute. They don't care whether you understand the statute. The whole intent is that you don't teach anything related to race, period.
Well, I think it's not going to work because there's no way, I mean, I think of people like myself, my entire education is African-American history, and I'm not about to change that. So, and I'm going to continue to do what I do. But I think it is important to at least try to make sense of it, to call it what it is. And you've done a very excellent job of providing us with the historical backdrop for understanding white supremacy and how it works. So I think that's been very important. And I also appreciate knowing that TAPSA and the Texas Educational Policy Institute, that you're out there on the forefront making contributions. And certainly you see through Dr. Esparza's very detailed presentation just how historically, how there's always been a reaction. And what's really interesting, as he pointed out, is that a lot of these courses that we now have and that we can actually earn PhDs in, they started out of movements and out of students, going to these universities and saying, we want to be able to read about ourselves. And now that we've gotten to this point where as he also mentioned, students can now study African-American history, they can study Mexican-American history, and boom, we have something coming from the legislature to try to control the way we think. But I ultimately don't believe that it's going to work. And Dr. Douglas, you mentioned earlier too, you alluded to the fact that things would probably never change. But I have to believe, just as our formerly enslaved ancestors did, they probably thought they would never be free. And what we're going to be fighting for now is intellectual freedom at every level. So I'm really grateful that we have organizations like SWATH that are outside the purview of normal kinds of systems. We're not part of, we're an independent organization. We have churches, we have other organizations where we can encourage the study of the folks who are in our congregations. So it just means that we're going to have to take history to the streets. And we can't leave it to others to make sure that we know about ourselves. We have to take full responsibility for celebrating our own histories. I want to thank each of you.
I hope that away with the understanding that I'm saying things will never change.
Okay.
I would be fighting the way I'm fighting if I didn't think things would never change. What I meant was, in my lifetime and your lifetime, we're not going to be where we want to be.
Okay.
Not that it can be better, but we won't be, in my lifetime and your lifetime, where we need to be.
Well, but what I'm really grateful for is that people like you and those of us who have come generations after you, we learn from those who have gone before us. And I think it's important for us to make whatever contribution we can to move more generations forward. So thank you again for tuning in. Thank you, Dr. Douglas, for offering us the wisdom that you have, just the expertise that you have. Thank you also, Dr. Darlene Breaux, for bringing a very powerful statement from your organization. Dr. Jessie Esparza, thank you for making us TSU proud with your presentation. And Dr. Bernadette Pruitt, we want to thank you also for showing up and making contributions to this very important program. So we are in the interest of, in our effort to make sure that we respect your time. I just want to share the screen one more time and thank all who have participated in SWATH 2021. Dr. Franklin, Dr. Bloom, Dr. Houston, Dr. Pitre, Professor Meeks, Nelva Williamson, Dr. Breaux, Dr. James Douglas, and Dr. Jessie Esparza, and yours truly, Dr. Karen Kossie-Chernyshev. Thank you again. And we are going to say, have a great evening.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Everybody be safe.
Okay, so I have ended the live stream. I've ended the awesome. Here.
I'm
Yeah,
here.
live stream. Thank you so much.
I am. I'm still here. Yes.
Great. Thank you
That
so
was
much.
wonderful. Wonderful.
Jesse, you hit it out of the park. Boom.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yes, he did.